All right, today's notes we're going to cover how movement happens, and we're going to go over the different types of muscle contractions, as well as the steps needed for a muscle contraction to occur. So the first thing we're going to go over is the types of skeletal muscle contractions, also kind of known as the tension stuff. So the first thing that you need to know is that tension in a muscle is going to result in one of three different types of actions. Right? And the first one is the one that you're probably more familiar with when you think of a contraction, is when the muscle gets shorter. This is known as a concentric contraction. The second type of tension, the muscle can actually remain the same length. This is going to be known as an isometric contraction. And then the last type is when there's tension in the muscle, but the muscle is actually going to get longer. And this is known as an eccentric contraction. So these might seem kind of counterintuitive. So what I have done is I went ahead and kind of sketched out an example for each one of these types of tensions or muscle contractions. So this is an arm, okay, and we see this here is representing like a dumbbell, some sort of weight, right? And we're going to see how these types of tensions work in a bicep and tricep. Okay, so this first one, this concentric contraction, is probably what you're more familiar with. This is when the muscle actually shortens and it causes joints or bones to come closer together. So in this case, is the hand or your wrist is getting closer to your shoulder. The second sketch that I have here is an example of an eccentric contraction. Okay, so this is the one that's kind of weird in the fact that it's a form of tension in the muscle, but the muscle actually gets longer. Okay, so the best example here is, let's say you're trying to pick up a weight, or somebody gives you a weight and it's really, really heavy, so your arm actually kind of drops, causing this muscle to get longer. And so this is known as an eccentric contraction. And then the last one, some people, if they are flexing and stuff, you can see their muscles because they're contracting, but they're not actually like moving or anything. So this is known as an isometric contraction. So iso for same, the length of the muscle stays the same. Okay, so concentric contraction is the one you're probably more familiar with. Isometric, the way that I remember, is because of iso, meaning same. So the length of the muscle is actually going to stay the same. And eccentric is kind of crazy, it's kind of weird. So it's a form of tension in the muscle that's actually going to result in the muscle length increasing. Okay. Something that I do want to point out for this example is, if we go back here to the concentric contraction, you see that I wrote agonist and antagonist. Okay, so typically your skeletal muscles are going to work in pairs. Okay? And the reason that they do this is because your muscles only pull, they never push. Okay, so let me try to move this up. Okay, so in this example, the bicep and tricep are working as an antagonist pair. Okay, so like I said, because muscles really only go in one direction, you have to kind of have the opposite in order for you to return to your original movement. So the agonist muscle is going to be the one that starts the movement. So in this case, the agonist would be the bicep, starting the movement, moving the weight closer to your shoulder. And then the antagonist muscle is the one that's going to slow or stop the movement and help return to the original position. So in this case, it would be the tricep that would, slow down or help your arm return back to its original shape. Okay, so now we are going to move on to modifications in your muscle, or more specifically your muscle fibers. Okay, so your muscle cells. So the first thing is going to be the cell membrane. The cell membrane is known as the sarcolemma for muscle fibers. It has its own fancy name. Then you have the sarcoplasm. Sarcoplasm is the fancy word for the cytoplasm, or the goo inside of the cell. Sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to be your modified ER, your modified endoplasmic reticulum. And then you also have your muscle fibers divided up into these functional units known as a sarcomere. So one contractile unit, basically one Z disc to another Z disc, which I'll go over toward the end. But basically just little chunks. Those are known as sarcomeres. And then you also have something known as a myofibril. So myofibrils are the threads that make up muscle fibers. So those are the threads, the proteins that make up one muscle cell. And these are going to be made of something known as myo for muscle, and then filament for, because it's like a fiber, it's a protein. So those myofibrils are made of myofilaments known as actin and myosin, which we'll get a lot more familiar with here in a little bit. And so, like I said, this is what makes up the inside of the muscle fibers. Okay, so the reason I just went over the modifications of the muscle fibers is because now we're going to go into something known as the sliding filament theory, which is going to explain how muscle contractions actually happen. So as we go through the steps, you're going to hear me talk about like the cell membrane and the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is, you know, the modified ER, and instead of cell membrane, you're going to hear sarcolemma. So I just wanted you to be familiar with these words before we went over these steps. All right, so like I said, the sliding filament theory is the steps that explain how muscle contractions happen across the myofilaments. And remember, the myofilaments are the fibers that make up the muscle cells, the muscle fibers. Okay. The big thing is that it does need energy. Okay. You don't work for free, hopefully. Neither does your body. Okay, so you are going to need energy for this to happen. So step one is you are going to have to get a signal. Okay, so that signal is going to come from a nerve, and it's going to travel down the nerve, and it's going to have to be passed on to the actual muscle fiber. And the way that that's going to happen is going to be by the use of a chemical messenger, and that chemical messenger, which is a neurotransmitter, so it's a message from neuron, and the specific one for skeletal muscle contraction is going to be known as acetylcholine. Okay, so this is very, very important. You are going to see this neurotransmitter later on as well. Okay. So then this neurotransmitter, this chemical messenger, is going to travel from the neuron to the muscle fiber, and it's actually going to kind of have to cross this space known as a synaptic cleft. Okay. So now, if you go down here, this is a pretty rough sketch of what is happening. Okay, so so step one goes from this half, this left side. Okay, so like I said, you have your axon, so you have your nerve, and it's going to be sending a chemical message in the form of acetylcholine. So that neurotransmitter is going to diffuse out of this axon terminal, out of this nerve, and it's going to cross this space here, which is known as your synaptic cleft, in order to get to the muscle fiber. Okay, so that brings us to this point when it actually makes contact, and that is going to be step number 2. Okay, so step 2, you're going to have acetylcholine, which I have here shown in purple. Okay, so this is the neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine is going to come and it's going to attach itself to the outside of the muscle fiber, and it's going to attach to the cell membrane. Okay, and remember, the cell membrane for muscle fibers is known as the sarcolemma. Okay, and this is going to result in a chain reaction. Okay, so here we have acetylcholine, which is attached now. And what that's going to happen is it's going to cause the release of calcium ions to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, so the ER, and it's going to be released into the sarcoplasm, which is the goo, okay, which is the cytoplasm of the cell. So we've had messenger released, and then it attaches to the cell membrane, and then this is going to cause the release of calcium ions, and that brings us to step 3. Okay. So calcium is going to be needed in order for muscle contractions to happen. Okay, calcium is going to help expose binding sites. Okay, so look back to the sketch down here. We have one myofilament, which is known as actin. Actin, when your muscle is at rest, is blocked off by 2 proteins. That first protein is tropomyosin, which I have here in like a purple kind of line, and then troponin, I have it here as like a little square. So whenever your muscle is resting, these binding sites are blocked off by these 2 proteins. They're kind of like the bodyguards. They're keeping it blocked off. But when calcium comes, calcium is going to cause the proteins to move, exposing those binding sites so that now contraction can happen. Okay, so troponin and tropomyosin are going to shift and no longer block the binding sites on actin. All right, now that the binding sites are exposed on actin, that brings us to step number 4. Okay, so step number 4, myosin is now able to attach to actin because, you know, we just moved troponin and tropomyosin out of the way. And so once myosin actually attaches to actin, it's going to form something known as a cross bridge. Okay, so once this cross bridge, this connection is formed between myosin and actin, the ADP, so adenosine diphosphate, and inorganic phosphate that were attached to myosin are actually going to be released. And when these 2 move away, it's going to cause the myosin to kind of do something known as the power stroke, which basically just means that it's going to pull on the actin, and it's going to cause the muscle to get shorter. And we'll see a sketch here in a second. So now, after the actin was pulled closer towards the middle, another ATP is going to come and it's going to bind to the myosin head, and that's going to make the myosin release the actin, and that's going to actually cause the breaking of the cross bridge. And so then once the cross bridge is broken, that new ADP that just attached is now going to be broken down into ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, and then inorganic phosphate. And it's done by an enzyme that's found in the myosin head. And so once the ATP is broken down, it's going to cause the myosin to kind of reposition itself back to the ready or cocked position. And this cycle is going to continue over and over until either the muscle is completely contracted or you get a signal to stop. The